And hence we have this meeting, encounter, perhaps a confrontation, if you will, between Yaakov and Esau, which turns out perhaps better than one would have expected, but not enough to bring about the Messianic era in the life of Yaakov and Esau. But this physical encounter needed to be foreshadowed by a spiritual encounter, and hence when he moves his family across the Yabok River, moves his possessions across, he remains by himself, and he wrestles with a man, as it's described, but the very well-accepted spiritual tradition that the man, who in fact was an angel, and not any angel, but the angel, the heavenly counterpart of the physical Esau down below. And so the question will be, who will prevail in this struggle? And Yaakov prevailed. But he was left with a limp because the angel did manage to weaken him. And it says that when he perceived, the angel, that he could not overcome Yaakov, he hit the socket of his hip. So his hip became dislocated. But nonetheless, he was not able to overcome Yaakov. And the verse concludes that Yaakov limped away, and therefore, verse 33, the children of Israel are not to eat the displaced sinew, in Hebrew called the Gid HaNasheh, on the hip socket, where the hip is to this day, because he struck the hip socket of Yaakov, where this muscle is called the Gid HaNasheh, and this is very relevant to kashrut, because this is the often called the sciatic nerve, which is not kosher, requires great skill to remove. And so the Ashkenazic tradition is simply not to take the hind parts of the animal, but to leave that. In Europe, it was possible to sell it to non-Jews, and we only eat the forward parts. That tradition, indeed that commandment, stems from today's Parsha. And it is that angel who tells him he will have a name change from Yaakov, which is in some ways pejorative, referring to the heel, the lowest part of the body, and he will be called Yisrael, the one who strives with the godly and prevails. There's a very interesting excerpt in the book of the Zohar, which is something that the Chatam Sofer comments upon in several parts of his commentaries, which he very much seems enthused by this idea. So the Gid HaNasheh is a Gid in Hebrew, that means like a sinew, which is like a muscle, basically. In general, the Mishnah tells us that the human being has 248 organs, and 365 of these sinews, which could be like veins or like muscles. In the Torah, we have 248 positive commandments and 365 negative commandments, don'ts. We also know that the solar year has 365 days. And so when we are told about the number of negative commandments, of prohibitions in the Torah, the don'ts, a reminder, a mnemonic is given that every day of the year is telling us not to transgress the will of God. By the same token, God, not on the level, of course, of his essence, but on a manifest level, also has what the Zohar calls the 248 organs or limbs of the king, and 365 sinews. And in fact, these are the commandments. And it says that when we keep a commandment, we unite that particular limb of the body or organ of the body with a positive commandment. If we are careful about not transgressing a negative commandment, so that part of the body associated with that particular negative prohibition is united with an aspect of godliness. And so the Zohar tells us that we have 365 days in the solar year, we have 365 negative prohibitions, commandments in the Torah, and the human body has these 365 sinews. And it goes further and explains that each day of the year is connected to a certain negative commandment, which is then connected to a certain part of the body. And all this becomes subsumed and explained in the story of the angel with Yaakov. And the Zohar tells us that because the Gid HaNasheh, the sinew, the sciatic nerve, was what was affected, so that day was a day that was connected to the Gid HaNasheh, to the sciatic nerve, the dislocated muscle. And it tells us that that day was none other than Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, which of course is connected with the destruction of the temple, which is the day that more than any other is the absolute prototype of the exile. And the Khatam Sofer writes at length about this, but the bottom line is that what we learn from this, which is connected in general to the mitzvah of not eating the Gid HaNasheh, not eating that nerve, and the famous book called the Chinuch, which explains the significance of the commandments, says that just as we learn that the angel was a representative of Esav, so we know that in all of the different persecutions and sufferings of the exile, this encounter at the beginning of our history is an indication that we will always survive and prevail. And so the Khatam Sofer takes it one step further and says, not only that, but the very day of Tisha B'Av itself contains this message of hope. So we must not lose hope and continue to be strong in studying the Torah with joy and keeping the Torah with joy and knowing that we will prevail, and that day will come when Tohu and Tikkun, energy and structure, are united, and that will truly be the time when we will accomplish what it says in the Aleinu prayer, Letaken Olam B'Malchut Shin Daled Yud, that we will unite, correct the world under the sovereignty of the Almighty God, and in that day, God will be one, and His name will be one. Shabbat Shalom.